My name is Callid Keefe-Perry, and I am a human. I live on the planet Earth. I travel in the ministry in the Religious Society of Friends. I'm a Quaker. Most folks call us that. We call ourselves Friends, which is a warmer title. So officially, when everyone else gets called like Reverend or Reverend Doctor, my title is capital F, Friend, which is pretty tight. Friend Keefe-Perry. And I am a doctoral student at the School of Theology at Boston University. So the question, what is theopoetics, is actually a really tricky one to answer, and like more so than normal for academic questions. And there's a couple reasons for that. But one of them is it was a word that got used in the 1960s and 70s to mean one thing. And by and large, it meant that thing because everyone was afraid Christianity was going to end. Circa the hippie movement and the death of God stuff, there was like, oh no, what do we do with the faith? And the theopoetics movement at that point in time was a conversation about how to renew language, how to renew thinking, how to kind of reach the kids. Then Christianity swung back with the rise of the religious right, and no one was worrying about the end of Christianity anymore. So by and large, the conversation around theopoetics went away. It kicked back up in the late 80s, 90s when things weren't going so hot for evangelicalism in the United States, and people said, oh wait, once upon a time we had this thing we were talking about when we were worried. Oh, we're worried again, let's talk about it again. And then it started to mean some different things. So there's a school of thought that comes from the 60s, there's another one that comes from the 90s, and then it got picked up again in the early 2000s by people who do process thought and Whitehead kind of philosophy and theology. The short version of it is, it's a desire to focus on aesthetics, on genre, on form, on containers, just as much, if not more than content. So, for example, we often say, a lot of people think of theology, and when you ask what theology is about, they're talking about the facts and arguments and stuff in the text, you know? So if I give you a piece of writing that's theology and you're supposed to read it, and then after you understand it, you tell me what the theology is. And the theopoetics idea is, it's not just the content of the text, it's the text itself. It's the style it's written in. It's the genre it's written in. It's the fact that it's written on a page as opposed to danced or sung or done orally. When we pay attention to the aesthetics of how we talk about something, it actually gives us more ability to understand that the container that something is in actually changes the thing that's in that container. So theopoetics, early on, obviously the word suggests theopoetics, poetry, and most people associate poetry either with spoken words or written words. And that certainly was an early theme. You know, how do we talk about God in a new way? How do we interpret texts in a new way, a creative way, more poetic, less scientistic, that kind of division. But there's been a recent push, at least in the scholarship of the last decade, to say, you know, this word poetics comes from a Greek word, poesis, and poesis isn't about poetry, it's about making. So how is God made? And we don't mean, you know, making God, but how is our understanding of God made? So there's been a recent push saying, well, what's the theopoetics of film? There's a dissertation that's being worked on right now around the theopoetics of dance, of hip-hop, of architecture. So how does things that humans make, words, buildings, 16 bars, you know, you name it, how do those human-made things shape our conception of how God is? And let's pay attention to the fact that they are made things, not just pure rational things that we've received from the heavens. So in the past 10 years, there's starting to be a push around some of these other things that are beginning to happen in theopoetics. But for a long time, yeah, it was primarily a textual thing. It's starting to switch a little. So, for example, a colleague of mine is a guy named Patrick Reyes, and Pat does some work in a place called Salinas, California, and he works with a community there of folks that are Chicano, Mexican American, and their roots there are, on the surface, Catholic. However, the Catholicity that exists in Salinas, California, is also very much influenced by native religion from Mexico, pre-Catholic native religion. So when he does research in Salinas and he's talking to people about what matters to them, things that are theologically or religiously rich to them, their answers come out of their mouths in a language that doesn't quite map on perfectly to Catholicism. First of all, it's not just English, it's Spanish, and it's also native languages that come from native peoples in Mexico. So if Pat were there listening with a kind of a prescribed paradigm of Catholicism that comes out of wherever, Rome or DC or some other place, and this is what he's listening for, he would begin to hear all these things and chart them into a certain kind of prescribed Catholicism. Instead, he said, no. If these people are talking about gods that are somehow different than Jesus, then I need to take seriously that they're talking about this and allow myself to rethink about what the questions I'm asking are, because I asked this question and was thinking of a certain kind of God. They heard the question and answered, but the answer doesn't fit with the way I'm thinking about it. I have to change the way that I'm thinking about what I'm thinking, because these people are answering in a different way. They're answering in a different language with different concepts about what God are, and allow them their voice. This is a big refrain that we hear in Theopoetics. How do you allow conversations about theology and religion to not become kind of colonized by a presumed way that things are, but allow things to speak out of their own position in a way that has more integrity than sometimes happens when we're trying to force things into paradigms or into kind of rational thought that makes sense to everybody. That means, part of what happens with Theopoetics sometimes is we're going to encounter a situation where we can't make much sense of it. What do we do with this? And we say, well, not all of it's going to make sense, as opposed to trying to tuck everything in neatly and kind of explain and argue everything into sense. There are often times, and I have myself been one of these people, folks who argue for theopoetics as opposed to theology, right? Theopoetics as opposed to theologic, and kind of set them up as a binary. I generally think that mode of thinking kind of goes down dead ends, and or worse than dead ends, things that are counterproductive and produce more kind of negativity that are not necessary. So what's happening when you do that is that you're positing it as a program. If we do it the poetic, imaginative, creative way, instead of the way all those old fogies do theology, then you'll do it better. Well, that just sets up another kind of monolithic program that then needs to be challenged. A colleague of mine, Blake Huggins, has a really good way of talking about it. He said, we need to kind of think about functioning within the paradigm of theology, and theopoetics functions as like a minor literature or a parasitic kind of scratch from the inside out. What happens when we stay within the academy or we stay within the church and poke and prod and push to grow the edges of it? If we try and take that pushing and prodding and growing and pull it out and put it somewhere else, well, then it can't really survive on its own. Or it's going to have to do the same thing that it has a problem with, argue for itself, make everything make sense, and say, no, we're better than that. And so there's kind of this idea that what it's doing is reconceiving and playing and toying on the inside. There's a big move in the kind of theopoetics literature now, understanding Christian ideas of what it means to be doing ministry as they overlap with hip hop. And there's a great example of the ways that theopoetics kind of is growing. James Hill is doing this work where he's saying what theopoetics is the theological equivalent of remixing. Oh, I remember that beat. Oh, I remember that line. Oh, I remember that doctrine. But now we've plugged it in a different place. We've changed the context. We've changed the thing, and I still recognize that hook. But now it means something different because it's surrounded by this, this, and this, as opposed to this, this, and this. So there's ways in which we understand it as an emphasis or a method within traditional theological discourse as opposed to something separate from it. Catherine Keller is someone who does a lot of theopoetics work, and she uses the language from Jacques Derrida, and she says theopoetics is supplemental to theology as opposed to a replacement for it. It always is going to function alongside the other larger discourses, kind of giving different context to it by traveling kind of in parallel roads along the way like that. One of the refrains that the people who are involved in the theopoetics conversation are often kind of heard espousing is that we have to pay attention to aesthetics. And if we start paying attention to context and to aesthetics, well, a part of that is the material things of a situation. If you start paying attention to things, you certainly start to pay attention to bodies. And once you start paying attention to bodies, you start paying attention to flesh. And we live in a culture and a society, especially in North America, but I think globally this is appropriate too, where not all bodies and not all flesh is treated the same. For example, there are ways to make critiques regarding what's sometimes called identity politics, right? You don't have enough women in your bibliography. You don't have enough queer voices or enough There's a critique that can be made on the level of identity. Some of the people who work with theopoetics are likely to make a critique like that. However, what theopoetics says, or the invitation that it makes, is if you pay attention to aesthetics, if you pay attention to the way that things are made, not because of an identity, not because of a certain political frame, but just as a matter of paying attention to what it's constituted by, then you'll begin to realize some of the same things that the political critiques make, but on the basis of aesthetics. So, for example, if I flip to my bibliography and I think, what makes up the thought that I'm using? And I imagine the people that all of my thinkers are, and I looking, at all of the people in my bibliography, and they all look like me. That is to say, their bodies are like my bodies. Well, then suddenly I realize I'm doing a particular kind of thing. Now, just that awareness is sometimes enough to realize, if I'm looking to be more broad in my thought and in my articulation, maybe I need to be talking to bodies that are different than mine. But it also ends up being the case that when you emphasize or you allow there to be space around the body, around the flesh, you allow a certain kind of knowing that you don't always get to have. See, the Western conception of what knowledge is usually construed as a kind of rationalism, kind of a neck-up thinking, right? Propositional thought, largely indebted to Kant, although there's certainly others. And the thrust of the theopoetics conversation is such that we want to honor the kind of knowing that happens in the body. There's a greater place for experience, for intuition, for the naming of experiences that sometimes get shut down. So, for example, there's ways in which you can have all of the arguments done well, all the propositions, all of the neck-up stuff done right. But it doesn't work because the content of it is in the wrong form. So, for example, Kate Common and Ashley Thuring are some folks who are doing a really fascinating thing. They say, you know what? Feminist thought has been around for a long time. There's some good arguments. We've had 3 waves of it. There's really good articulation about why feminism is important, but it doesn't always seem to be getting that much traction. I wonder why that is. It doesn't seem like they've got the ideas or the arguments wrong. Well, maybe it's because we're presenting it in the wrong way. And so they've taken on themselves to start doing feminist filmmaking, doing theological content in the context of film. Nothing innovative in terms of argument or theory or any of the content, but changing the vehicle of it so that it becomes more embedded in narrative and visual and auditory, in the hope and the thought that because they've changed the container, the content might actually be more acceptable to people. So in 2005, I first found out about this word, theopoetics. I was taking a class with Scott Holland, who's a professor at the Church of the Brethren Seminary in Richmond, Indiana. And it was like 1/2 hour of one day of class, and it was this word that came up, theopoetics, and then he kind of moved along. And I kind of like, put on the brakes, like, what is this idea? Well, I was fascinated by it, and I kind of said, what is this thing? He's like, well, it was big in the 60s and 70s, and I kind of think it's neat, but it's a little passé now. And I said, why is it passé? He's like, well, and there wasn't really a good reason for it yet. And so I kind of think in a providential way, I was really compelled or lured, or something about it was really grabbed me. So I started to kind of look into this stuff, and where did it go? Where did it come from, first of all? Where did it go? Where is it now? And decided, again, having media be the thing that thrust me into the world, I made theopoetics.net. And at that time, 2007 or so, I could say safely that everything that had ever been written in the English language with the word theopoetics in it, I had read. And it all went up online. References to everything that the text, everywhere that word and idea was, it was all online. And as a result of having a website, as opposed to publishing a journal article that 8 people would read, people started emailing me. And they said, can you tell me more about this? Can you tell me more about that? And so I started making YouTube videos explaining things that people had questions about. Hundreds of hits on YouTube videos, like explaining bizarre, like postmodern principles in terms of how they interact with Christian theology. So then people who were looking to find out about it found this weird website that this random guy wrote. I was teaching middle school English at the time, so I was just like this dude who had a website that people thought was useful for academic stuff. And so people wanted me to start writing articles for journals because I was the guy. So I started writing journal articles, and people started inviting me to conferences, and they were like, where do you work? And I was like, McAuliffe Regional Middle School. And so eventually my wife was like, what are you doing? And then I ended up, after doing kind of academic scholarship, going to seminary for the first time, finishing a degree, and did it along the way that way. And now, 2015, there's at least 11 seminaries or divinity schools that not only teach theopoetics, but have a course where the word theopoetics is in the title of the course. There was none in 2005, and there's at least 11 now, 10 years later. That's pretty wild to me. So Amos Wilder is important to the theopoetics conversation because of his book, Theopoetics. He's the brother of Thornton Wilder, who people know for Our Town. He's the playwright. And Amos was his brother, and he was a theologian and biblical scholar and poet. And probably everything would have been kind of unremarkable about him other than kind of good scholarship, except he went away to war and Emestimo. So when he came back and tried to kind of do biblical scholarship and theology kind of normally, it wasn't enough. There wasn't enough, he calls it creatureliness. There wasn't enough bodiness to it. He was trying to figure out how he could write theology that made sense for someone who'd just been through World War I. It wasn't tracking. And so he started to think, what's missing? What do I need to be doing more of? And he said, we need to be paying more attention to the way that bodies contribute to imagination. And he has this really beautiful line, and he says, before the sermon, the song, before preaching, the poem, we are more compelled by fables and fabrications and stories than we are the points they make. We, in theology and religion, need to give more emphasis on the pre-rational and the imaginative, or we will never bridge the gap between the old words and the new world. Right? That's written as early as 52, 53. And he wrote this book, came out in 1974, and at the time, it was a big deal because everyone was like, oh no, right? All the hippies are taking our Christianity away. The commies might come. Any kind of things that was being said, late 60s, early 70s. And this book, Amos Wilder's book, was a rallying cry to say, look, we got to start talking about this differently. We have to engage more seriously with what the young folks are thinking, how they're acting, how they're talking. And it became a flashpoint at that moment for kind of what theopoetics could be. He's the first major writer to address it at any length, and he's the first author of a book that specifically addresses that kind of titularly. So theopoetics as a conversation is reemerging now. There's more players. There's people interested in it because of post-colonial perspectives. There's people interested in it because of its populist trajectory. People interested in it because they're artists. There's people who are interested in it because they're novelists and poets who are religious, but they're not dogmatically or doctrinally fundamentalists, and there's nothing to do with their work. They can't publish it because they're too Christian to be secular, but they're not secular enough to be published in the mainstream. So what do we do? So there's this set of people who've come around a table to say, this is a useful category for us. Let's talk about aesthetics. Let's talk about it in a way that is pretty significant and profound. And so there are lots of kinds of ideas about what theopoetics is that kind of are swirling around this center. There's lots of definitions for it that have lesser or greater affinities. The folks that I think are really cutting edge right now would be Catherine Common, Kate Common. She's a graphic designer who has a second career moved into theology. And she's fascinated about the way in which changing messages and branding changes the message itself. Patrick Reyes is a practical theologian and a religious educator who's really fascinated in how you change research methodologies as a result of some theopoetic principles. Blake Huggins is kind of a continental philosopher par excellence who's doing some really exciting work regarding what the actual practice of writing does in terms of theological thinking. He does a lot of work with Derrida, and he's my go-to guy for continental thought in general. I'm really excited by the work of John Gill and James Hill. That's funny that it rhymes because they're both really into hip-hop and theopoetics, but that was an accident. Really trying to figure out what does it mean that what everyone's really engaged with in large urban centers, especially folks of color, that addresses things the church used to address, right? Poverty, community support, outreach, growth, all those things are talked about by hip hop and listened to more than the churches listen to. How do we reconcile the fact that a lot of times church don't want to talk about hip hop, but at the same time, hip hop is the thing talking about the very issues that the church used to talk about? What do we do with that? That's great, because that's probably him.
Photobomb. There we go.
Your stuff has got to be tight. Like, you got to know your stuff, and at the same time, be able to play on the playing field with people who are doing kind of an older version of the academy, a very kind of structural, propositional, data-driven way. You got to be able to do that. Most people in the theopoetics conversation agree that, at least in terms of the academy and the church academy collision, you got to be able to do old school. For me, that means that I'm conversant in the stuff I'm conversant in. So my particular focus is doctrine of anthropology and human sin and human becoming and our goal as people made in the image of God. So we have to be able to kind of do the theological work as it has been done for hundreds of years. However, at the same time then, we need to be then testing our theological concepts with people that are not in the academy. We need to be hearing how it is received by people and then editing our work to be received better. That doesn't mean we have to dumb it down. It means that we need to be paying more attention to our work. For me, that means there's always going to be a practical end to it. That might mean I'm going to be doing, as part of theology, policy recommendations. That's something I'm engaged with now. And I understand those policy recommendations to be part of the theological project. Do they count as doctrine, or am I citing Anselm in this education policy piece I'm doing? Nope. But if I take seriously that theology isn't just the writing of academic theology, well then you're sure that this piece of policy or that film that's being made or this piece of that this album that's going to drop is a piece of theology. And I would affirm, both in my own work, that things that are not just academic theology are nonetheless still theology, and also that the work of my colleagues that is, quote, not appropriate for the academy is nonetheless still cutting edge, rigorous theological work. And so it's a twofold thing for me. One is I'm going to kind of rep myself to say this work that I'm doing that doesn't quite fit in the academy is nonetheless theological and contributes to the theological project. And the work of my colleagues that doesn't fit is vital, and I want to make sure to touch and hit on that stuff so that we can together kind of push the edges of what it is, because by and large the church is in terms of theological stuff, decline. We see churches and communities sending fewer and fewer people to seminaries and divinity schools. They're closing down left and right. And meanwhile, we keep rearranging the chairs on the Titanic, doing things the way they were done before. We got people learning Greek and Hebrew and not Spanish. We got people who are living in an academic world of 100 years ago. Meanwhile, all around us, people are doing things that are speaking to the reflections of God that we're not paying attention to. And so in my work, I want to make sure that the doctrinal and the constructive theological things that I'm doing and the constructs I'm modifying also make sure that they have on the other side some practical changes to the way people live their lives. Otherwise, I'm a pretty big hypocrite.